The screen is black. A low, ominous hum begins, slowly growing in volume. It's the sound of 1,000 men humming a single deep note. Then, the sharp rhythmic clang, clang, clang of metal striking wood joins the hum. It sounds like a monstrous metallic heartbeat. Listen to that sound. It's the sound of 500 axes beating against 500 shields. It's a sound that once echoed across the water and made 50,000 soldiers abandon their posts. It's the sound of fear given a voice. In the year 1038, this sound was the prelude to an invasion that should have been impossible. A tiny force of Norse mercenaries, fighting for an ancient empire, landed on the shores of Sicily to face an enemy that outnumbered them 100 to 1. They were not expected to win. They were expected to die. What happened instead defies all military logic. Fortresses that had stood for centuries were emptied overnight. Veteran commanders who had faced down armies turned and fled at the mere rumor of their approach. An entire civilization, at the height of its power, was brought to its knees by a handful of warriors who seemed more like monsters than men. This is not a simple story of conquest. This is a story of psychological warfare, of how terror can be forged into a weapon more effective than any sword. You are about to witness how a future king of Norway earned his fortune in blood, how an empire's greatest general orchestrated a campaign of perfect, calculated brutality, and how it was all undone, not by an enemy army, but by a single act of betrayal whispered 2,000 miles away. How do you make an army forget how to fight? How do you convince them that the men marching towards them cannot be killed? And what happens when the unstoppable force you've created is turned against you? If you are ready to explore the dark arts of medieval warfare, where history was written in blood and terror, then stay with me. The story I'm about to tell you is one that the history books often forget, but one that its victims could never erase from their nightmares. Sicily, in the 11th century, was the center of the world. It wasn't just an island. It was the pivot upon which 3 civilizations turned. Whoever held its ports commanded the arteries of trade that pumped lifeblood between Europe, Africa, and the glittering East. Its fertile fields were the breadbasket of kingdoms. To the Byzantine Empire, the inheritors of Rome, the loss of Sicily 2 centuries earlier was more than a strategic defeat. It was a phantom limb, an ache of lost glory that never subsided. For 200 years, the island had flourished under the Islamic Caliphate dynasty, a beacon of culture and power. But now, that light was flickering. The emirate was tearing itself apart. Civil war had fractured its strength, and from the south, Zirid warlords from Africa had landed, burning and pillaging, enslaving fellow Muslims in a brutal campaign of chaos. The island that once projected power across the Mediterranean could no longer defend its own shores. It was a jewel ripe for the taking, bleeding into the sea. Into this maelstrom enter the giants of our story. The first is a man who was a giant in truth as well as reputation, George Maniakes. In an era when the average man was lucky to clear 5.5 feet, Maniakes towered over all, a colossus of a man whose tactical mind was as sharp as Valyrian steel. He had never lost a battle. His name was a bogeyman, whispered by Arab mothers to frighten unruly children into silence. His genius for war was matched only by a capacity for chilling brutality. When Maniakes conquered a city, the survivors were few and the lesson was absolute. The second is a prince in exile, a young man of 23 with ice in his eyes and a hunger for a crown. Harald Sigurdsson, later known to history as Hardrada, the hard ruler. The Norse sagas would paint him a hero, but the truth was far darker. He was a fugitive, having fled Norway after a failed rebellion that killed his half-brother. Now he served in the Byzantine emperor's most elite unit, the Varangian Guard. He was not fighting for honor. He was fighting for gold, mountains of it, enough to buy the armies he needed to sail home and drench his homeland's soil in the blood of his enemies. Sicily, with its legendary wealth, would be his treasure chest. The catalyst for the storm was an act of desperation. The ruling emir of Sicily, facing annihilation from the Zirid invaders and ignored by his overlords in Cairo, sent a delegation to Constantinople. It was a plea for help. He offered the Byzantine emperor a share of his kingdom, in exchange for imperial troops to drive out the Africans. But the emperor, Michael IV, was a man who smelled opportunity in the scent of weakness. Why share an island, he reasoned, when you could possess it entirely? He summoned maniacs. The order was not to aid the emir, but to obliterate him. It was to be a full reconquest. The emir in his desperation had not invited an ally, he had unlocked the cage of a lion. The strategic calculus was immense. If Byzantium reclaimed Sicily, the balance of power between Islam and Christendom would violently shift. The Muslim advance into Europe would be checked, and the Mediterranean would once again become a Roman lake. But Maniax had a special kind of hell in mind for the island's defenders. He wouldn't just bring the disciplined legions of the empire, he would unleash the Varangian Guard. The Muslims of Sicily had faced enemies before, but they had never faced men who killed for joy. Maniax assembled his invasion force with the meticulous precision of a watchmaker. This was to be a perfect instrument of war. The corps was 10,000 Byzantine regulars. These were the inheritors of Roman military science. Armored cataphracts that moved like fortresses of scaled iron, their lances capable of punching through shield and man alike, mounted archers who could fire a dozen arrows a minute from a galloping horse, infantry drilled in formations so ancient they had faced Hannibal. These were not conscripts, they were career soldiers, and their trade was death. Then came the 5,000 Lombard cavalry from southern Italy, led by a ruthless Norman adventurer, William de Hauteville, a man who would one day be known as the Iron Arm. These were descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, a new breed of warrior who had fused Norse ferocity with Frankish discipline. They brought with them a tactic that would later shatter the armies of England at Hastings, the devastating all-or-nothing cavalry charge. But the tip of the spear, the element that transcended military science and entered the realm of mythology, was the Varangian Guard, just 500 Norsemen. Each was a nobleman, an exiled prince, or a second son, with no inheritance but his own strength. They came to the gilded city of Constantinople to seek their fortune, swearing a blood oath to the emperor. In return for a king's ransom in gold and silk, they offered unmatched savagery. Harold Hardrada commanded his personal retinue within the guard, men who had followed him from the frozen darkness of the north. They were a terrifying spectacle, their hair braided with Byzantine gold, their shields painted a stark, menacing black. Their primary weapon was the great Danish axe, a 10-pound blade on a 5-foot haft, an instrument capable of cleaving a horse's head from its body or splitting a helmeted man from crown to groin. The sound they made when they marched, the rhythmic clang of those axes against their chainmail, was the sound of approaching doom. The invasion fleet itself was a marvel of logistics, 300 ships, from bronze-rammed dromons armed with the legendary Greek fire, to lumbering transports commandeered from across the empire. The preparations were staggering. Long before the first ship set sail, Maniax had begun his true assault, a campaign of psychological terror. Byzantine agents, disguised as merchants and travelers, spread across Sicily. They disseminated tales, carefully crafted to inspire maximum fear. They spoke of Varangian atrocities in the wars against the Arabs in Syria, of how they built pyramids from the skulls of their enemies, how they fought on with horrific wounds, their rage making them immune to pain. They whispered that the Norsemen were drinkers of blood and eaters of flesh. Most were lies, but they were seasoned with just enough truth to be believable. By the time the fleet gathered, a wave of primal fear was already sweeping the island. In September of 1038, the fleet crossed the Strait of Messina. As the 300 ships appeared on the horizon, arranged in a perfect, menacing crescent, the Muslim commander on the walls of Messina felt his blood run cold. It wasn't the number of ships that struck terror into his heart. It was the sound that carried across the waves, the deep, unified, inhuman hum of the Varangian war chant, punctuated by the thunderous rhythmic beating of their axes against their shields. The heartbeat of the apocalypse. The landing was unopposed. The garrison of Messina, which was supposed to contest the beachhead, had already melted away into the hills. The campaign had begun. The first trial by fire occurred just hours after the landing. A force of 2,000 elite Muslim cavalry, the pride of the emirate, located a contingent of Varangians. It was 300 of them caught on foot in open country. Confident in their numbers and mobility, the Muslim commander ordered a full charge. It was supposed to be a massacre. It became a demonstration. The Norsemen didn't flinch. They didn't run. They locked their shields, planted their feet, and became a wall of wood, iron, and muscle. This was the shield wall of their ancestors, but refined by Byzantine discipline into something far more terrifying. It was an immovable, interlocking barrier. The cavalry charge, a force that could shatter infantry lines, slammed into it and broke. Horses screamed, rearing in panic, refusing to charge the wall of glittering axe heads and unblinking eyes. The psychological shock was instantaneous. Then, from the center of the line, Harald Hardrada stepped forward. He moved with a calm, predatory grace. The Muslim commander, an Emirate champion named Khalil ibn Yusuf, who had reputedly killed 17 men in single combat, rode forth to issue a challenge. The duel was an insult to the word. It lasted less than 10 seconds. Hardrada adjusted his grip on his great axe, and with a single, fluid, almost casual swing, he took the champion's head from his shoulders. The decapitation was so clean, so absolute, that Khalil's body remained bolt upright in the saddle for several seconds, a grotesque statue, before tumbling into the dust. What happened next became legend. The 2,000 horsemen, having just witnessed their champion dispatched as if he were a fly, turned and fled. No order was given. It was a spontaneous collective flight of terror. They had seen men die before, but they had never seen death delivered with such contemptuous ease. The way Hardrada showed no emotion, no cry of victory, simply wiping his axe and stepping back into the line. It was not human. The survivors carried the story, and the story became a virus of fear. These were not men, they were something else. This victory of terror became the template for the campaign. Maniacs advanced at a speed that defied military convention. Fortresses that were marvels of engineering, designed to hold for months, surrendered without a fight. The garrison of Rometta, fortress perched on a cliff and considered impregnable, saw the Varangian vanguard approaching from miles away. They watched the black shields and glinting axes, heard the faint echo of the death songs on the wind, and they fled. They left their gates open, their weapons stacked, and hot meals still on their tables. Maniacs refined his psychological warfare to a science. His mobile Byzantine horse archers would first appear, harassing the defenders and sowing unease. Then came the heavy Lombard cavalry, their massive charges a terrifying spectacle. But the masterstroke was always the final act. The slow, deliberate, inexorable advance of the Varangian guard, marching in perfect formation, their axes beating that soul-shaking rhythm, their ancient, guttural chants promising a bloody end. In each captured town, Maniacs instituted a grim protocol. The garrison commander was always executed in the main square, always with a single stroke of a Varangian axe. But then, one man, usually the youngest soldier, would be set free. His task was to carry a message. Tell them Maniacs is coming. Tell them the Varangians hunger. Tell them resistance is death, but flight is permitted. It was a stroke of genius. It offered an escape, making the act of fleeing not cowardice, but prudence. It made the act of resistance not bravery, but suicide. In 10 days, more of Sicily was conquered than in the previous 10 years of warfare. The final stand was to be at Syracuse. Here, the emir had gathered 15,000 of his best remaining troops behind 40-foot-high ancient Greek walls, fortifications that had repelled invaders for 2 millennia. This, he believed, would be the rock upon which the Byzantine wave would finally break. Maniacs studied the defenses, his mind a cold calculator of death and geometry. A conventional siege would cost thousands of lives. But then, Harald Hardrada and his captains came to the general's tent. Their request was madness. They wanted to take the city alone, 500 of them, against 15,000 behind impregnable walls. They wanted to do it that night. "Give us one night," Harald said, his Greek rough but his meaning clear. "If we fail, you lose only Varangians. If we succeed, Syracuse is yours by dawn." It was an act of supreme, almost insane audacity. Maniacs, recognizing the predatory instinct in Hardrada's eyes, agreed. As total darkness fell, 500 shadows detached themselves from the Byzantine camp. They had blackened their mail with soot and wrapped their weapons in cloth. Moving in small, silent teams, they reached the base of the walls undetected. Using ropes and raw strength, they began to climb. The sentries on the walls, straining their eyes for a sign of a mass assault at dawn, never looked down. Within 30 minutes, 100 Norsemen were crouched on the battlements, specters of death waiting for their signal. The signal was not a horn or a shout. It was the sound of a man drowning in his own blood as Hardrada's axe opened his throat. And then, the night exploded. 500 Varangian war cries screaming till Valhalla and blood for the All-Father shattered the peace. The psychological detonation was total. Defenders, jolted from half-sleep, found the demons of their deepest fears standing among them, axes already slick with gore. The fighting on the walls was not a battle. It was a methodical extermination. The panic was infectious. Gate guards, hearing the Norse war cries from above and seeing their own comrades leaping from the battlements to their deaths, simply abandoned their posts and ran. 20 minutes. That's all it took for 500 men to break a defense that should have held for a year. By dawn, Maniacs led his stunned army through gates that had been thrown wide open. The city had collapsed from within. The emir was found hiding in a water cistern, shivering. The palace treasuries, containing the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries, were captured intact. The Varangians, now unleashed, hunted the fleeing defenders through the streets and olive groves, their bloodlust raging until Maniacs himself rode out and ordered a halt. Syracuse, the jewel of Muslim Sicily, had fallen in a single night. The myth of Varangian invincibility was no longer a myth. It was the gospel. The campaign reached its bloody crescendo at Troina. Here, the last great Muslim army, 25,000 strong, made its stand. Their commander had convinced them that the Varangians were just men. It was a fatal miscalculation. Maniacs used his army like a surgeon's tools. He feigned 2 retreats, drawing the overconfident Muslim army down from their hilltop fortress into a narrow valley. Then, the trap was sprung. From concealed positions on the valley's flanks, the 500 Varangians emerged, descending like an avalanche of iron. Their war cries echoing off the valley walls made 500 sound like 5,000. As the Muslims tried to flee back, they found their escape cut off by the Byzantine heavy cavalry. The valley became a cauldron of death. The slaughter was systematic, merciless, and absolute. When it was over, 15,000 men lay dead. The will to resist in Sicily died with them. 3 months. In 3 months, Maniacs had conquered 3/4 of the island. The campaign was a masterpiece, a stunning testament to Byzantine military power. Victory was total. All that remained was the final march on the capital. The future of Sicily seemed sealed. It would be Byzantine once more. Then a ship arrived from Constantinople. It carried not laurels and reinforcements, but chains and a death sentence for the campaign. In the glittering paranoid halls of the imperial palace 2,000 miles away, the success of George Maniacs had been his undoing. Lesser men, including the emperor's own brother-in-law, Admiral Stephen, could not stomach his genius. A web of lies had been spun. The speed of the conquest was twisted into proof of collusion with the enemy. The low Byzantine casualties were presented as evidence that he was not truly fighting. The captured treasure? He was obviously hiding the real prize for himself. In a scene of theatrical cruelty, the empire's greatest general was arrested in front of the army he had led to impossible glory. Veterans who had followed him through fire and blood wept openly. The Varangians gripped their axes, their knuckles white, their eyes fixed on Harold Hardrada, waiting for the single word that would unleash a mutiny. Harold, ever the pragmatist, remained silent. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. With Maniacs gone, the campaign didn't just stall, it imploded. Admiral Stephen, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his incompetence, took command. He immediately broke the army into scattered garrisons, destroying the concentrated force that had been the key to their success. The Muslims, who had been paralyzed by fear, realized the monster was caged. Their courage returned. Coordinated attacks began to strike the isolated Byzantine outposts. The Varangian response was immediate and final. They had sworn an oath to the emperor, but their loyalty was to the general who had led them to glory and gold, not to the fools who had betrayed him. Harold Hardrada assembled his 500 warriors in the main square of Syracuse. In a gesture of ultimate contempt, they raised their axes in a silent salute, not to the empire, but to their imprisoned commander. Then they turned, and in a funereal dirge they beat their axes against their shields, a slow, mournful rhythm for the death of competence. They marched to their ships, taking their gold, their axes, and the terror they commanded with them. Without the Varangians, the army was psychologically broken. The golden demons were gone. The systematic conquest became a systematic collapse. Fortress after fortress fell. The lands won with such brilliance and ferocity were lost to incompetence and stupidity. The most successful military campaign in a generation was over, ending not with a bang, but with the whimper of political intrigue. The irony is staggering. Sicily was eventually conquered by Normans, led by the very same William de Hauteville who had ridden with maniacs, using the very tactics he had learned from the Byzantine master. Harold Hardrada used his Sicilian gold to seize the throne of Norway, ruling for 20 years before his destiny took him to Stamford Bridge in 1066, where the last great Viking king fell, ending an age. The Byzantine campaign of 1038 remains a ghost in the pages of history, a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been. It proved that the empire, at its peak, could create a military force of unstoppable power. But it also exposed its fatal, incurable disease, the enemy within. The empire feared its own successful generals more than it feared any foreign army. The axes that had conquered an island could not cut through the red tape of jealousy, and so, a victory that could have changed the world was left to rot in the Sicilian sun. A monument to the timeless truth that the greatest empires are not conquered, they commit suicide. What victory in your own life have you seen squandered by fear or jealousy? The names and the centuries change, but the story remains the same. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark heart of history. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribe for more tales of epic warfare and human folly. Ring the notification bell, because history is full of ghosts, and we have many more to uncover.